All right, thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate you attending my talk. My name is Amanda Laucher Graham. I'm a Senior Director of Strategic Solutions at a consultancy called Eighthlight. We're a small consultancy, only about 150 people, which means I get to do really cool, fun things and solve hard problems. I have been a software consultant for many years, and after many years in the industry, I decided I wanted to learn more about law. I was learning a lot about data privacy at work and hearing a lot of the horror stories, and I wanted to understand more of the legal considerations around running my own company, which I was doing at the time. So Northwestern University Law School provided a wonderful space for me to do that and to learn more about a combination of computer science, law, and business, which I think is kind of a prime time for that at the moment. Okay, so welcome to a world where code rules. You may have seen me before speaking about type systems, talking about the implementations of programming language features, talking about the intricacies of how programming and math align, talking about the value of both types and tests, and ensuring that we're actually doing what we think we're doing with our code, which seems pretty important. And a much younger, more naive, more bold me might have even stood on stage and questioned your ethics if you weren't thinking about the same things when you were putting code into production. So you wouldn't be surprised to know that when somebody starts talking about code as law, code ruling, it got my attention. I got very interested very quickly. So the idea is really simple. When you hear the idealists talk about it, the idea is really simple. Laws of sovereign nations are not as powerful as the code that is working in production for applications that people are using day to day. Seems pretty simple, seems pretty straightforward. Nobody's like passing out at that thought. It's a really powerful thought experiment though, and I'm hoping that through this talk, it ends up giving you some cool thought experiments for the day. I'm assuming you all know what code is. Many of you have probably heard about smart contracts, which are automated contracts most notably associated with operations on the blockchain. Most of you have probably written code in the past few days. As a developer, hearing this may also scare you. It may make you feel a little bit ill. It did for me at first. Many thoughts might be crossing your mind. The code I wrote with that looming deadline and all of those obnoxious status updates, I hope that none of that has actual legal implications. That might cross your mind. Oh, great, this must be an American thing. They love spending time in court and they hate their government. That might be one of the thoughts crossing your mind. Or maybe, while this sounds like some narcissistic developers decided that they could rule the world and got a little bit off the rails. All of these things would be perfectly normal. And even potentially the word blockchain itself made your stomach turn a little bit. With the bad actors and the crypto Ponzi schemes, I can understand where you'd be coming from with that as well. I was in the same place, and then I had a colleague, a very good friend, teach me kind of the good parts and the powerful things that could happen with blockchain. So I think that most of us already know that there is some function of ethics in our jobs in software development. We're thinking about how the code we write impacts people and affects the people who are using our systems. As everything is shifted left and we're thinking about everything from operations to product thinking to security to literally anything that touches software development as an industry, nobody is focused on saving time and just getting things into production. And I'm sure I didn't see anybody sitting out by the fire pushing code to production last night, drinking a craft beer. That would never happen. So the phrase code is law was coined by a man named Lawrence Lessig. This was back in 1999, long before there was such a concept of blockchain. And he was just thinking about, well, if we have no regulation over the internet, that doesn't mean there's no regulation with the internet. It literally just means that the software developers get to make the choices that impact society. Software developers have all the power because they write the code. And this was very much true back in the 90s. If you remember the internet back in the 90s, it was a very different space. Today, I would argue that many people who tell software developers what to write have no idea how to write the code themselves. Many people are involved in this interaction, and the software developers and the people who are involved in deciding what is going to go into production, I don't think that they're often spending enough time thinking about how is this going to impact society, how is this going to affect people's day-to-day lives. They're certainly not thinking, oh, the decision I'm about to make is my values now encoded in a software system. So what is law? In order to understand the phrase, you need to understand what is law. Believe it or not, it's a highly debated topic. Feels like it should be pretty straightforward. Absolutely not. But a definition that I really like is that laws are rules that we put in place to control how members of society, people, businesses, the government itself, interact with each other and with the resources that they have access to. So we have several different types of law. Criminal law to protect the public. We have civil law to protect individual interests. Think like contract law, IP, property, family law, dispute resolution, that sort of thing. We also have administrative law in the US. And law is often a very political thing. We elect people who seem to have a clear mind and a nice smile, and we hope that they share our values and that they pass laws that will help us to live the lives that we want to lead. Hopefully, they're passing laws that benefit us. Now, people who make the laws and people who interpret the laws in the United States are two different groups of people. Laws are interpreted by courts. What is written down is not interpreted by the same people that wrote it as the people who need that law to be interpreted for them. So how do courts interpret the law? They look at the everyday meaning of the text. What does the language mean? And as you probably all know, English can be a very ambiguous language. It could be very difficult to determine what was meant in the writing of a sentence if you weren't in the room where it happened. If the statute's long, different provisions are considered within the broader statutory context. There's such a thing called canons of construction, which is an ordinary way in which we look at interpreting a statute. Sort of like the laws of how a programming language would be interpreted. Courts may look at legislative history. They want to look at how the statute was implemented. They're looking at both the letter of the law and the intent of the law. So what is actually written, the word's actual meaning might not be how it is interpreted if the court decides that the letter of the law is not what was the intent at the time that it was written. Okay, so quick thought experiment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time teaching you about law, but I do want to get you in the right frame of mind to think about how does Coda's law affect us as a society. So I want you to think about this law for a moment. No vehicles allowed in the park. So presumably I can't drive my BMW through the park to save 10 minutes on my way to work. I don't own a BMW. I just chose a car. If you own a BMW, I'm sure you're not in a hurry to get to work. That is not a thing. Probably this law is saying you can't do that. We can all agree on that, I think, maybe. What about if we want to put an old tank as a memorial to potentially a war that had been fought that residents locally had lost their lives in? What if we wanted to put that tank in the park as a memorial? Could we do that, according to this law? It doesn't have a motor, and maybe they meant motorized vehicles. Hard to know. What about an ambulance on the way to save a dying person? Sign doesn't say anything about that. What about a kid on a hoverboard? Hoverboards didn't even exist potentially when this law was written. Potentially the people didn't even have the capacity to think about what a hoverboard would be or how it would end up in their park in the first place. Is that legal according to this law? So how might you rewrite the law to add clarity so that the people who are interpreting it could determine whether or not you wanted the hoverboard or the ambulance in the park at that time? You could do all kinds of things. You could say motorized vehicles, you could say moving vehicles, you could say motorized vehicles that actually work. There are a lot of different ways you could say in case of emergency, you could say a lot of things. However, it gets long and it gets very specific, and the people who are writing the law, we might not know this, made it ambiguous on purpose. They were doing that for several reasons. One reason might be that they wanted their constituents to feel heard We've done something about the things that you've been talking about. You're welcome. They may have wanted to leave it flexible and open for the future. They may have been in a hurry and said, we don't actually have time to think of all the edge cases. And then there's this thing called jurisdiction. Jurisdiction essentially is who has power to rule over this law and to interpret this law based on a specific situation that you come to them with. Jurisdiction could be based on the disputed activities were happening in a certain location. The parties are residents of that location, even if the activity happens somewhere else. You could have something called diversity jurisdiction in the US where the parties live in different states, so you take it to a federal court and they can handle it based on state law, but federal procedure. And if you live in different countries, there may be different jurisdictions, and it could get really complicated to determine who has the jurisdiction over this case. Interestingly, if you have a data privacy issue, it could also come into play where the data was sitting. Where was it hosted at the time that the incident occurred? If you can determine that, which is interesting. Okay, last piece of law, education, if you don't already know, the legal tenets behind what is a contract. In order for something to legally be a contract, it has to have a few things in place. There has to have been an offer. There has to have been acceptance. There has to be consideration, which means that there has to be something of value exchanged. There needs to be intention to create a legal contract. And then capacity and legality are probably the obvious ones for most people. So if all of these things in place, we have an enforceable contract. And if there's a breach of contract, you could take it to court and obtain damages. Okay, so smart contracts. I briefly mentioned this in the beginning. I'm going to talk about smart contracts a little bit in this talk, but basically everything I talk about doesn't actually have to be backed by a blockchain in order to meet the definition of smart contract where it is used in code as law. Blockchains didn't exist when that phrase came out. So maybe consider it a superfluous piece of information because laws have been written around it that make it feel important even though it's superfluous for code as law. So smart contracts are self-educating automated contracts. The terms of the agreement are directly written in code. This seems great, right? Write the law, write the terms of the agreement in code, and then execute it. There's no ambiguity. Code is not as ambiguous as English. It can be processed by computer, it can be automated. Importantly, in some law, in some statutes, the code and the agreements contained therein exist across a distributed, decentralized blockchain network, distributed ledger. And due to the immutability aspect of the blockchain, no change is possible on a deployed contract, and after the transaction has been verified, it can't be changed. It can't be reversed, it can't be changed. So smart contracts automate processes and transactions in a transparent, traceable, and irreversible manner. All of these things seem great for when you're trying to figure out what happened in a situation or if a contract was breached. So also, without the need for a central authority, legal system, or external enforcement mechanism. What you should have heard when I said those words is less expensive than regular contracts. Less expensive. Lawyers are very expensive. They can cost somewhere around $500 an hour, and it can take a lot of time to get something through the court system. So less expensive and more timely. Contracts have great benefits, smart contracts. So how are smart contracts written? In programming languages. So most of us in this room probably write code, so we understand programming languages. Some of the languages used for smart contracts, the popular ones are Solidity, which is very JavaScript-y, and Viper, which is very Python-y. There's another language, which as you start to think of code as law, I have this personal feeling is a much stronger fit, and that language is called Rust. So many of you have probably heard of Rust. Some of you have maybe written Rust. And as you think of some of the features of strong ownership and borrowing, you can start to see how this could align with contractual obligations. So code is not flexible. It's not ambiguous. Running systems do not consider the intent of the law. They do not consider the intent of the contract. They consider the letter of the contract. There are canons of interpretation, but they're very rigid, and we already know them when we know the programming language. So we know what's going to happen, we know what's going to execute. It can be deterministic. Non-determinism is not a good thing in code. It could be a good thing in natural law, it's not a good thing in code. It's often much more difficult to prepare for the future when you're writing code. And when you do, people on Twitter will tell you that you are prematurely optimizing or you are over-architecting or whatever the case. It's difficult to think about what could come in the future within the code. So smart contracts, they are lacking in comparison to regular contracts, but they do have a lot in common as well. And they can make things a lot less expensive. So are they enforceable? Yeah, absolutely. That's why I told you the elements of the contract, because I wanted you to see that the elements of a smart contract exist just the same. And long-standing principles of contract law come into play. We didn't actually need to write new laws to handle this stuff. We already had laws. Smart contracts are contracts that have been negotiated, the parties have manifested consent, and there's a digital signature. So courts still retain the jurisdiction to award damages if there's been a breach. That didn't change, that's still there. Courts can still handle contracts in the exact same way, even if they're automatic and happening on a blockchain. There's something called oracle in blockchain, and an oracle allows the blockchain to interact with the outside world. So say I need to have a human intervention, a human needs to say something happened, or say for some reason in my contract I needed to determine was the weather a certain temperature or was there a certain amount of rainfall or any of that stuff. That's all something you can get from an oracle. Well, a court can come in and say your oracle is invalid, I am negating that, and I am going to award damages to the other party. So courts still have quite a lot of power. US common law allows for express or implied contracts, and the contracts can be memorialized in code or in writing or in any other way where the court can determine that you had an intent to have a contract. In fact, in the year 1893, so a very, very long time ago, the US Supreme Court upheld a contract to sell cotton via a series of telegraph messages. This is potentially one of the first electronic messages that signified an actual contract. So super interesting case. From there, we've had lots of progress. We have something called the UETA, Uniform Electronic Transaction Act, and the e-Sign Act, Electronic Signatures in Global and National Commerce. All of that to say, you can digitally sign things. We're probably digitally signing things all the time. In fact, if you have a computer or a phone, I know you are. Every time you download and install anything, every time you sign one of those really long documents that you definitely did not read, you just went to the bottom and clicked yes, that is, you are contractually bound, you are obligated by the promises that you made in that contract. If you take it to court, the company that has made you sign that will win. So those are the reasons why that is possible. So who has jurisdiction? Normally in a contract, in a smart contract even, you'll have a jurisdiction clause. That says where the jurisdiction is. If this thing is not going well, we're taking it to court and here's where. If you don't do that, we still have the situation where we have people who are impacted are sitting in a location. That location has jurisdiction. Or the location of the assets, the location of the operations, or even the location of the nodes in a blockchain. Think about how hard that would be to figure out. These things are massively distributed. You can run a node from anywhere. But if you're running a node in any specific place and they can prove it, you may be in a jurisdiction where the law could apply. There could also be international laws and treaties, and those may have jurisdictions as well associated with them. Regulatory laws, if you do something that violates the SEC, there's a very good chance that they're going to come and find you. You're still under their jurisdiction if you're operating in the US. And then there's such a thing called international arbitration. If something goes wrong, and Probably you've heard of some of the things that have gone wrong, and I'm going to share some kind of fun stories of things that have gone wrong where international cases have come about. So overlapping jurisdictions, this is not a new thing. Also, code is the law, but also the law is the law. The law doesn't go away. And the people who are enthusiasts around code is law sometimes disagree with this statement. They think that they have this sovereign nation, a network nation is what they call it, and they feel that they get to make the laws, they can be encoded within smart contracts, and that is what they have to abide by. We'll get back to that later. Okay, so things get tested, right? Like the way that we determine whether or not code is law is we see it go to court. And it did in a Canadian case of Cicada 137 LLC versus let me try and say this right, Mediedovic. Mediedovic was a teenager who exploited a blockchain smart contract fault and was able to take $15.8 million and put it in his own account. Pretty cool for a teenager. This guy was a mathematics major. He had a master's in mathematics from the University of Waterloo at 18 years old, so pretty sharp character. And he said, this is fantastic. I have $16 million in my account. Now what? Well, now what? He got sued. Like somebody filed a lawsuit. And really interestingly, read these cases. If you get the chance, read the docs. They're really fun to read because judges say things like, this is great. This is a great time to have this case. This is an important moment in history where we really want to try this case. We want to see how it plays out. Come to court. Please come to court. Put that $16 million with a neutral third party, and whoever wins the case is going to get the money. You could still walk away with the money. Well, this guy said, nah, that doesn't sound good to me. I'm now 19 years old. I've got $16 million. And why would I want to go to court? That doesn't sound fun to me. So they did a little back and forth. Basically, the court system was asking, come to court, come to court. We really want to process this. This seems like it could be big news. It could be really exciting. Let's do it. He said no. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and his parents' house was raided. He disappeared. He went into hiding. His parents' house got raided. They took all the electronic devices. They had to fight a battle to get their devices back, to have their privacy kept, because this kid, I can't call him a kid, he's over 18, he's disappeared. And the parents say they have no idea where he went. This became a fairly expensive process for the parents, and the guy is still on the run. And in fact, he tweeted, very bold guy, as somebody is at 19, right? I was bold at 19. He says, the people who I traded against and won money from, read the same contract I did and were willing to deploy their capital on it. At no point in this process did I do anything that could not have been done by anybody else. I love this guy. He had the chance to set legal precedent and make big international news, and he said, yeah, but 16 million bucks, why would I do that? He still pops up occasionally with other situations that are similar, where money goes missing. His bank accounts or his smart contract accounts seem to find some of that money. And he's still very famous on the internet. So I don't know how that'll play out for him. It might get boring living on the run. He says it's not that hard. So we have trade-offs. As with everything, we have trade-offs. He gets to keep the money, but he has to live in hiding. Okay, so what did we learn? After all this happened, I read this really interesting article about what we learned. What we learned is that instead of going after this person with a legal case, what you do is you contact them through legal counsel. You don't mention anything about police. You don't mention anything about arrest. You don't mention anything about lawsuit. You just have somebody reach out, find where they are, find where the money is, find all the things, have access to them, and then you pounce. Only at that point should you consider implementing lawsuits or freeze or try to recover assets. They found the fault in this case, the procedure fault, was they acted too soon and they gave them too much information too quickly. I think maybe what we actually learned is that the law is only the law if it can be enforced. In this situation, we had no power to enforce it. Yes, there's the law, but no, there are not enough resources or the desire to enforce it in the way that would have been a successful outcome for the unhappy party. So in a smart contract, the code is automatically executed. It's doing its thing. You can't stop it. And that's pretty powerful. We can lock a person up if they steal money or if they commit fraud, if we can find them. That's awesome. Can you force them to give back the money? This money sits on a blockchain somewhere. Can you force that money out? Potentially. Very, very rare situation, potentially. Unlikely. It is unlikely that any country would have had the power to actually make a big difference here. Even if they got the guy, even if they put him in jail, he would have had to have given away a lot of information to get that money back to its potentially rightful owner. I don't know. It didn't actually get tried. He might be the rightful owner. So the law is only the law if it can be enforced, but this works both ways, right? So there are lots of jurisdictions that don't have a ton of resources to enforce their laws. So if their laws are operating on smart contracts, this gives them a leg up. Things are happening without them intervening, and without the intervention, they're saving money. They're saving time, they're saving money, and they're getting the outcomes that they're looking for. So this seems like a really positive thing, while it may also be negative. So good and bad come from this. Okay, so some of you, anybody who's been paying attention to the platypus breach, last month in France, so two brothers took $8.5 million from the platypus finance and said, oh, we're white hats. We did this to make sure nobody else did this. We were teaching you a lesson. You're welcome. They got sued. They went to court. A warrant was also issued for their arrest. They got arrested. They went to court. The judge says, charges dismissed. Potentially, code is law. Everybody had the same smart contracts. Everybody could read the contracts. Everybody knew what they were getting into. Code is law, won in this instance. This did not go the way the vast majority of the industry expected it to go, so it's a really interesting case. Anyway, these guys are free, and they have $8.5 million. The way these things typically play out, and I think in this case as well, I don't remember the exact numbers, they gave back a portion of the money. They took a bunch, gave back a bit, got to keep some. The way these things are tending to play out nowadays is the company that feels like they've been breached, they go to the person who is the bad actor, potentially bad actor, and say, well played, nice job. I'm going to give you $1 million, and you're going to give me back the rest. Thank you. You've taught me my lesson. Nobody goes to jail. How do I know that? How could I possibly know that? Well, the only reason I could possibly know that is because those people actually do go to jail, right? You say that, you take the money, they admit fault basically, they go to jail, you get all your money, and then I get to read about it. So if you're ever in the situation where you've done this, be careful with your decisions. No matter how much you believe in code as law, the government that you're working with it may or may not. Okay, so I said I wouldn't go on and on about blockchains. Here's something else to talk about. In the UK, there's a law that evidence produced by computers is treated as reliable. Cool. In England and Wales, courts consider computers as a matter of law to have been working correctly unless there's evidence to the contrary. Evidence produced by computers is treated as reliable unless you have evidence that suggests otherwise. This is called rebuttable presumption. A court will treat the computer evidence as working perfectly unless you can show why it's not the case. This is a real challenge, an unsurmountable challenge in some cases for some people. Everybody in this room, if you end up in court and there's computer evidence against you, first thing you're going to say is, yeah, right, that evidence is wrong for this, that, and the other reason. Here's what I can show you about that evidence. Think about your friends and family who don't know how software works and don't know how buggy software is. What are they going to do? How could this go wrong? Okay, well, in the UK, we have the case of Bates versus the Post Office. From the year 1999, the Post Office in the UK was using a system by a company called Horizons. Hundreds of postmasters were found to have committed fraud and theft because the system said that the accounts for their post office were low. Hundreds of people were convicted, sentenced to imprisonment, fined, had their property confiscated because of evidence that was submitted by Horizon Computers. That was 1999. In 2019, just a couple years ago, 2019, a judgment in the litigation of Bates v. the Post Office found that it is possible that software errors made this look like the accounts were missing money, and they were not, and no fraud was ever committed. People sat in prison until 2019, where this was appealed, and now they get their lives back. How many of you have written code that is operated within the UK? Or stored data for people from the UK? Are you 100% sure that the data that was collected is 100% indisputably accurate? You may have impacted lives and you didn't even know it. Because why would you think about that as you're writing your code day to day? It's just, it doesn't cross your mind if you're not thinking about the legalities of it. Because I bet the product manager wasn't either. Okay, so in the US, we're a little bit further behind. We have not implemented a lot of the great things that have been implemented in other places, but we have done some cool things. In DC, for instance, Washington, DC, all of the laws have been put on GitHub. They haven't been translated into smart contracts, but they are open source on GitHub. You could submit a change request. If you need a pull request, you can do that. They're not written in programming language, but they have been translated into a very respectable XML. So if you want to read the law in XML, you can go onto GitHub and do that. Potentially not as forward-thinking as some other jurisdictions that we've talked about, but it is an interesting start. So what about smart contracts in the US? United States state law, remember that's different than federal law. Each state gets to make their own laws. They wanted to appear friendly to blockchain. So essentially all these blockchain companies were starting up and lots of money was going there. So states wanted those big money companies to come there. Arizona kicked it off by writing the first law, and several other states followed suit, just copy-pasted the law. How could that go wrong? So here's the Arizona law. Here's how they describe portions of the law that they use to describe the technology for smart contracts so that they could become appealing to all these blockchain dollars. So blockchain, an event-driven program, or a smart contract, is an event-driven program with state that runs on a distributed, decentralized, shared, and replicated ledger that can take custody over and instruct transfer of assets on that ledger. Okay, that's interestingly vague. Not really sure where they're going with this. Some of the words get a little fuzzy. And then it gets even better with describing a blockchain as distributed ledger technology that uses distributed, decentralized, shared and replicated ledger, which may be public or private, permissioned or permissionless, or driven by tokenized crypto economics or tokenless, where the data on the ledger is protected with cryptography, is immutable and auditable, and provides an uncensored truth. Whew. There's nothing about this that is easily interpreted. However, interestingly, no blockchain actually claims to be an uncensored truth. So as far as we know today, this applies to nothing. And based on the laws that I talked about earlier, it didn't need to be written. We already have laws to cover this. All they were doing was trying to entice businesses to come to their state and deposit their money. So this was a superfluous law, doesn't add a lot of value, and no blockchains actually can stand up to what they're defining. So code as law idealists are fading in business, but there are sovereign network nation enthusiasts. These are people, I like to think like, when I started to hear about the metaverse, I started to hear about this at the same time, Thinking about people who they don't want their countries to have jurisdiction over them anymore. They're tired of the laws in their own countries. They think that it's time to throw it all away, start fresh, and start with smart contracts. Super interesting conversations. You can learn a lot about where society may go by having conversations with these folks. They're very idealist. They're often very young, so they're interesting, they're interesting thinkers. They're creative. They're bringing a lot to the table. But the idealists are starting to fade because everybody has their limits, right? We keep having these cases where $15 million, $100 million, $250 million goes missing. We have our limits. I'm okay to forego, make a trade-off for this smart contract, code is law. I'm willing to trade off some of my time, some of my energy. I'm okay to lose a game. I'm okay for somebody else to lose money. I'm okay with a lot of things. I'm not okay with the numbers that we're talking about. I'm not okay with it destroying lives of human beings. And I'm not okay with things like launching missiles. All of these things could happen based on the idea that code is law is the only law. So I think because people have limits, we're starting to come to a more rational space where we can actually start to talk about it in a way that doesn't just turn people off immediately. Most people, not everybody, but most people in most societies do have the limit that they're not willing to go to jail for a belief that hasn't been proven and that they have no reason to die for. So what would it be like to live in an algocratic society? This is the question that you kind of have to ask yourself as you start to learn some of these things. The power to shape the rules of society goes from the elected officials to people who are writing code, which is pretty interesting. As a person who writes code, I'm in. I like that. But also as a person who writes code, no thank you. I do not think I should be president. I do not think a lot of things should come from, I don't deserve that power. The problem is that some of the people or companies that are writing the code may not be held accountable in the same ways that democratic society would be, because it's also impossible to enforce every law on every person who has violated it. Who do we want to control our society? So I think we're coming to this hybrid system. We're starting to see it with smart contracts, hybrid with normal contracts. So you've got a text contract that you write, and within the contract you refer to smart contracts that you're going to operate. I can see lots of places where this would come in handy as a software developing consultant. We work with contracts all the time. I can see where a client may come to me and say, here are tests that you have to pass with the system. We've agreed on these tests passing with a system. We're going to run that through a smart contract, and we're going to have another contract that's going to say you're going to put the best people that have the skill set on the job. They're going to do the best of their abilities. Things that you can't put in code, go in writing. Things that you can put in code, go in code. Err on the side of code where possible. I've heard it stated that it's a great way to think about it is a contract that is sort of like a long-term marriage relationship should be written in ink, because a long-term relationship, business-to-business relationship, grows and changes over time. Contracts are amended, they change, they're extended, lots of things happen. If you're having a one-night stand sort of business relationship, go ahead and put it on the blockchain, have a smart contract. The more complex the contract, the more chance that you either need to be hybrid or in writing. So a law firm and an insurance company in the States have recently translated a standard insurance flooding contract into smart contract. They were able to get a very big portion of the way there and say that it's actually really feasible to do this. Some of it needed to be in writing. A big majority could be in code, which is great because that will save on processing claims, that will save on contracting, that will save on premiums. We should save money as we start to see some of these bureaucratic things go more towards smart contracts. So there are some great advantages. Legal proceedings are expensive and time-consuming, and enforcement is hard. Not the only one to know this. There's a country, I put it on a map, Estonia. You can see it here. They have something called e-Estonia. They started collecting data and thinking, how can we digitize all of our interactions, all of our bureaucratic interactions? How can we digitize those sooner rather than later? In fact, even before the blockchain paper came out, even before the Bitcoin paper came out. Back then, they were calling it, in 2008, hash-linked timestamping. They also referred to it, don't get too ill, I know you're technologists, digital defense dust. Who doesn't want to have digital defense dust protecting their assets? And when I say assets, the things that are run on the blockchain in Estonia are healthcare registry, property registry, business registry, succession registry, digital court system, surveillance tracking information system, and then the official state announcements and state gazette, as well as a mushroom tracker. So apparently there's a lot of foraging there, and you want to find out if your mushroom's poisonous or edible, you can do that via the blockchain. Interestingly, maybe not interestingly, you won't be surprised to hear, they're also the first country to have been cyber attacked at a national level. What does that actually mean? I think those details are really, really fuzzy. Being called the first to be attacked at a national level may be something that I wouldn't be so proud of. However, when potential bad actors see that your entire country's healthcare system is digitized, they may want to take advantage and attack you. So that's Estonia. Look them up. If you're at all interested in Coda's law, they're a really interesting case. And not only do they do it themselves, they offer guidance on how you or another jurisdiction could do it as well. So I find that pretty exciting. They're taking advantage of the good parts. So I also heard an interview with Lawrence Lessig, a very recent update, where he was asked, is code still law? He laughed. He said, well, I had to say yes because there's a lot of people going to jail to die on that hill. If simply for them, yes. But in all honesty, code is more law than ever. The code that we're writing contains our values, and determines the experiences of individuals. That code often conflicts with what we say our values are. And that's a big problem. And everybody in this room has a little bit of capability of thinking about that and how we can help to impact that. So a reference that he made was to surveillance capitalism and privacy. And I think that's a really good reference to how good intentions turned very bad very quickly. The use case was marketing. They wanted to market to us as individuals as opposed to just in the masses where we would be bored and not interested. They wanted to sell things we wanted to buy. They wanted to make our life more convenient. Great. What it turned into is an unplanned side effect is they're able to surveil all of us all the time. Going off the grid is not easy. Being a part of society and not having your phone, not having a computer, not having access to the internet is no longer an easy thing to do. So it probably started with good intentions and went horribly, horribly wrong. So something else that is going horribly, horribly wrong, this came out in the news last week. The award-winning Halo Smart Sensor, which is advertised as helping healthcare and senior living administrators meet their regulatory obligations, providing safe, clean, comfortable environments, is now being deployed in UK school bathrooms to prevent rowdiness, stop vaping, and stop bullying. What this system does is listen to your children in the bathroom constantly. Feels like they maybe started out with good intentions. Do you think the developers for these systems thought they're going to be listening to children in the bathroom? That's like beyond anything I could have ever imagined. Okay, but we do have laws. We can enforce things. Here's a really good example that happened in the last 2 weeks as well. AT&T, Sprint, T-Mobile, and Verizon have been busted for selling our location data. All that location data they collect from your phone, they sold it to people who wanted to make money off of it. So people paid for it. It wasn't anonymized, and they did nothing to protect what that data is going to be used for. No due diligence in even asking the question. So that's cool. The FCC gave a $200 million fine across the four of them. AT&T 2023 profit, $72.305 billion. The fine for them individually was $47 million. Okay, so this fine is meant to deter them from doing this in the future. It's meant to stop them from doing bad things, and the publicity, the press, is supposed to deter us, help us to make better decisions about who we do business with. We should only do business with people that we trust. And that, in this case, when we're getting phone service in the US, should not be AT&T, Sprint, T-Mobile, or Verizon. There's nobody left. What could be the alternative is how could they have enforced a law that these companies knew about? How could they enforce it in a better manner? Should they shut down the phone companies? Should they take away our ability to have our phones? It's really tough to think about what could they have done differently that could have had impact. Put people in jail. I would definitely hear that argument. I would definitely hear that argument. Somebody made a decision at some point, or a series of really bad decisions were made, and people profited. And I don't know how much you've read about your your location data is a digital footprint or a digital fingerprint. Even if it wasn't anonymized, having your location data, they can determine exactly who that person is just based on following them around on their phone. You have a digital footprint that is based on your location. And these folks took advantage of it. So it's 2024. There's no way I could stand on a stage and not mention AI. What about AI? So remember I talked about how you couldn't have smart contracts that like grow into the future and predict the future and do things based on intent as opposed to the letter of the law, the exact code. That's now being debated with ML and AI. There is the idea that these systems could actually get to know you, know your history, know who you are, how you interact with the world, and make decisions based on that. And that could be integrated into a smart contract. Non-determinism is bad. Non-determinism is bad. We won't know where this is going to go until it's done. When you hear folks getting very excited about AI, plus the blockchain, plus IoT, putting it all together, ask the question why. What's happening with this information? What's going to happen to my lifestyle? What kind of society do I want to live in? Because maybe this is exactly the type of society we want to live in. We've not tried it yet. So English is the programming language of choice. This is what Van Baker said at a Gartner conference just last fall. When talking about AI, he said, this is the programming language people want to use. Everything I've said in this talk should make this very scary statement. English is ambiguous. There have been efforts to create controlled subsets of English that are computer processable, and they have been really good efforts. But they're programming languages. They turn into programming languages. They have rules. You have to think like a programmer in order to use them. Language matters. As I start to hear about the power of smart contracts and all the great things they can do for me, I also have concern about JavaScript being the language of choice to make sure something is provably correct in production and managing my life. So I mentioned earlier that Rust is a language that's starting to get more traction, and it has a lot of great features that make it more secure, more robust, and very applicable to the blockchain. But there is a big complaint that it has a steep learning curve. The problem with the learning curve is it costs money. Businesses have to pay money for people to go through that learning curve and know something that other people, the general masses, don't. So should we require them to pay a little bit more money and have more complex ideas, potentially implementing our smart contracts? It's a question that's up for debate. So thanks for coming. I hope this leads to some interesting thought experiments for you. And if you want to reach out and tell me how amazing this new society is going to be, or how scary, or just how terrible this talk was, please feel free to reach out. I'd love to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming.